Hey friends, today's episode is sponsored by the ultimate streaming service for horror, Shudder. Shudder is a must-have for all true horror aficionados, bringing you brand new supernatural terrors and edgy-your-seat thrillers every week. One recent addition is the award-winning coming-of-age tale, Slapface, in which a victim of bullying finds an unlikely companion in a frightening forest-dwelling monstrosity. Then there's the terrifying but touching All the Moons, the story of an orphan girl cursed with vampiric immortality. Not to mention, They Live in the Gray, which tells the tale of a social worker forced to face off against a litany of livid apparitions. On top of that, Shudder recently celebrated Black History Month by adding Queen of the Damned, starring Aaliyah, to its horror noir collection, an assemblage which celebrates African American representation in scary movies. Now personally, I was absolutely blown away when I browsed through Shudder's library, as it includes an extensive collection of cult classics and contemporary masterpieces from both home and abroad. But out of all the movies I've binged over the past few months, the one that stuck with me the most was a movie called Kill List. Kill List tells the story of an ex-soldier turned hitman who takes one final job to pad out his retirement fund, but what should have been a simple but lucrative contract spirals horribly out of control when the involvement of a sinister and far-reaching religious cult begins to threaten all he holds dear. Honestly, Kill List is one of the grittiest, most shocking films I've seen in a long, long time, and its riveting climax will leave you in a state of near catatonic horror. I was so sucked in by it that I found myself watching it a second time, and the ability to use Shudder on laptops, smartphones, and consoles made that much easier to do. And for just $5.99 a month or $56.99 annually, you too can get access to some of the most stunningly original movies and TV series around. And since Shudder truly appreciates us horror fanatics, it's given me a unique promo code that gives you guys a 30-day subscription completely free of charge. Just go to shudder.com, shudder.com, and enter the promo code Let's Read and check out Kill List for yourselves. Without further ado, on with today's stories. Back when I was in year 10, I went on a school trip to Russia with our school's history society. We all thought it would be the adventure of a lifetime, but it turned out to be a complete nightmare for two different reasons. Firstly, we were on the way to our hotel in St. Petersburg, and it was terrible. We were basically on a coach for 36 hours straight, with a stop only every 12 hours or so we could get some food and stuff. A trip to one country ended up being a trip to like 7 different countries, but then almost as soon as we crossed the border over into Russia, weird stuff started happening. All of a sudden, and this is right at dawn too, so most of the other kids were asleep, but the bus driver started raising his voice with our teacher, who then started to sound really scared. And that's when the beeping started. 2 cars were on either side of the coach, one front, one back, and they were flashing their lights and beeping their horns. Our teacher is telling the coach driver, who was a Russian guy, not to pull over because he's scared of what the guys in the cars are going to do. But then the coach driver is saying that if he doesn't slow down and stop, then there might be a crash, because the car in front kept dangerously slowing down, trying to force our coach to a stop. As we slowed to a stop, we thought we were about to be kidnapped by the Russian mafia or something. It was honestly so scary. But then the guys that stopped us turned out to be people sent to warn us of that exact thing. Apparently, rumors had gone around that we were being targeted for kidnap, but the guys that were beeping had been sent by the hotel to protect us. There was a big argument between our bus driver and the protection guys because they had guns with them, but the driver and our teacher didn't want them to be on the bus with guns in front of us kids. In the end, we had no choice but to have the guys with guns, not Kalashnikovs but smaller ones, sharing the bus with us until we got to our hotel in St. Petersburg. The next thing was that when we were in our hotel at night, none of us were allowed to leave our rooms. If anyone did, the guys with guns would shout at us in Russian to go back to our rooms. I mean, we couldn't understand what they were saying, but it didn't take a genius to work out what they meant. We went out sightseeing for 2 days with the same isolation at night, but then one day there was a switchover with the security team that was guarding us. All the guys we had come to recognize disappeared, and then a new team took over of entirely new people. Then, that night, and I didn't hear or see this because it happened on another floor in the hotel, our bus driver must have come back from going somewhere, and one of the security team challenged him in the hallway. Our teacher later told us that he tried to explain that he was the bus driver and that he was part of our group, but the security guard who'd stopped him demanded to see some kind of proof of this. Obviously, he didn't have any proof other than showing him his driver's license and uniform from the coach company he was from. Then, get this. Instead of just letting him go past to get to his room, the security guys started beating him up. A few of the kids came out of the rooms to see what was going on and literally saw the security guy just beating the life out of this bus driver. The driver then basically just disappeared after refusing to drive us anywhere else. We were basically stuck in the hotel for another day, and we were supposed to drive on to Moscow to see some of the sights there, so by the time we got to another coach driver, we were already a day behind. Then we got the bad news that we wouldn't be going to Moscow at all, and our teacher had basically arranged for us to go back to England early. We were all gutted about that, but we also noticed something else. Our teacher seemed really shaken up about something, and we all thought it was the whole battered coach driver situation, but it later turned out to be something else. He didn't tell us until we got back home, as he didn't want to scare us. But then one day in our history society, the very last one before our exams, he told us what he thought was happening and what the battered coach driver had told him. He gave us a little side note, saying he didn't know anything for certain, but the one thing that was clear to him is that he didn't want to put us in any danger. The bus driver had told him that the guys guarding us were all Russian secret agents, and that there was never any threat of being kidnapped by the mafia. They were basically sent by the Russian government to keep an eye on us in case we were some sort of spy group disguised as a school trip. When he was being beaten up, the driver said that one of the agents had called him a traitor who was in bed with the English, and that if he didn't make himself scarce, then next time he'd be taken somewhere secret and shot. And that's why he refused to drive us anywhere else, and why he refused to come back to the hotel. Now, as our teacher said, it could have been the bus driver being all dramatic, but our teacher also confirmed to us that when the security team had been asked to show their credentials, any kind of document or card to confirm that they were a private security company, that they basically refused to show us anything. They'd also refused to tell us any of their names, where they were from, and any questions were just met with a wall of silence. Our teacher said the whole thing was probably one of the most unnerving experiences of his life, and it made it all the scarier to think that he had to protect 20-plus kids from the Russian Secret Service, and he was terrified that they'd choose to detain us or lock him up if he didn't do exactly what they told him. The whole thing caused a big drama in our school, and loads of parents of kids who went on the trip were up in arms about how we could be put in such danger. It is definitely the craziest thing that happened to me in all of school, and that's my scary story about the time we visited Russia. A few years ago, me and a few friends went to Russia for a Christmas vacation. First thing we did after such a long flight was head out to a bar, and we started trying out the different flavors of vodka. When it was our turn to get drinks, we start to try to speak Russian, but the bartender immediately smiles at us and asks, "American?" Turns out his English was really good, so we reply like, "Yep, American. Don't hold it against us, please." He just laughed and made a peace sign with 2 fingers, then asked us why we were in Russia. I told him we were on vacation, then asked him for 5 shots of the chili vodka. 2 European guys at the bar started talking to my friends and I, and we suggested playing the I Never game. Both the guys were bragging, saying how much they could drink and how pretty we all were. They even joked that since there were no boys with us, that they can pretend to be our boyfriends to keep the creeps away. We excused ourselves to the bathroom, then instead of finding generic male and female toilets, we were greeted with just one individual bathroom. Then when we looked inside, we found ourselves staring in on 5 guys, all dressed in suits, and sitting down at a small table, like an actual toilet. They straight away turned their heads towards us and said something quickly in Russian. And that's when I noticed the gun on the table. "Oh wait, I'm so sorry, we were just trying to find the toilets," I remember saying, and we tried to make a quick getaway. Another guy kinda did a half smile and says in perfect English, "I'm sorry for my friend here, but the real toilets are the way you came. I could show you if you like." My friend Deb is now still holding my hand and slowly edging backwards where we came from. "Thank you, but I'm sure we'll find it." We just wanted to get out of there, and we rather shakily left that area and was engulfed by people again. We went back to the bartender and explained that we couldn't find the toilet and that we nearly got shot while trying to find them. I explained how the guys looked, and it was very odd that there wasn't anyone else but them in there. "Oh, that's fine. Don't worry about them," he said all chill. So I asked, who are they?" "Oh, just the local mafia. Nothing to worry about." Then asked, "Another vodka?" Me and my friends were just standing there with our mouths open, and after hearing that, I wanted to leave and go to the hotel bar. How could the bartender be so casual and laid back about this? I know it's not much of a story, but who can honestly say that they nearly got shot by some Russian mafia guy? My name is Katerina, and I'm from a place called Chelyabinsk in Russia. I'm sorry if some of my English is not perfect, but I am learning more and more every day. But the point of my email is to tell you a story, one I hope very much you'll read on your YouTube channel because it's something I will remember till the day that I die. I wanted to tell you about the day I thought the world was ending. It was in the morning of the 15th of February 2013, and since I was still in school back then, I was in classes that morning. We were studying old Russian writers, and on that morning we were reading a book by Maxim Gorky while discussing the themes of his writing. It was a nice clear weather outside, but even at past 9 a.m. in the morning, it's still almost dark in the winter time where I live. So when our classroom started to light up very quickly, almost like the sun was rising very fast, some people looked to see what it was. Then all I heard were people gasping, my God," again and again. Then I looked too, and this is what I saw. It was a huge ball of fire flying through the sky, and as it got closer to the earth in the distance, it got brighter and brighter until it flashed so bright and went out. A few seconds later, we heard a huge explosion sound, and then everything went very quiet. The next thing I remember, our teacher was telling us to get away from the windows, but no one listened. And suddenly, she began screaming about how the glass could break and slice us up, so we all backed off and tried to shield ourselves behind our desk. And she was completely right. As the next thing, we felt as if though we'd been hit with a huge shock wave, and all the glass from the windows shattered and flew inward at us. There was so much screaming and shouting. We were all so scared. People in my class were asking, "Was that a nuke? Are we at war now?" Our teacher tried to keep us all calm, but even he was very shaken and scared by what had happened. We were all wondering what we should do, and so our teacher told us very calmly to leave the upper floors of the building we were in and to all meet up at the school sports area since it was a very strong brick building. When we all walked outside, we smelled this very strong burning smell, and this scared us even more because one of the boys in our class was saying, "It's definitely an American nuke because you smell this when one explodes." He had no idea what he was talking about, but at the time it made all of us so scared, and we were all having our eyes on the sky expecting more of the fireballs to fly over our heads. We were all so scared. Some people were asking if it was the end of the world, and I actually thought it was the end of the world too for a few moments, but I know now that it was just my fear talking. All the students met in the sports area and we listened to the radio to find out what was happening. And that's how we found out that we were safe and it was just a meteor having exploded in the atmosphere. But some other people in Chelyabinsk and other areas had not been so lucky, and the meteor's explosion had hurt people and even destroyed some buildings. I later heard that more than 1,000 people had to go to the hospital because of injuries caused by the meteor's explosion. When it exploded like a hand grenade, sending pieces of space rock flying everywhere. Some people were hit by these pieces, or they crashed through windows or roofs, and people were cut by glass or slate. One person even had a broken back from being hit by a larger piece. I don't know if they died or not. More than 200 people were either blinded by the flash or suffered from a burning in their eyes for a short time because they had been looking at the sky when the ball of fire exploded. These people were much closer than we were, and so I think me and my class were very lucky that morning. People that were closer to the exploding meteor also had sunburn from how brightly it shined when it exploded. They called those flash burns, and we were told the very same thing happened when the USA dropped nuclear bombs on Japan. So, although it wasn't a bomb, it had very similar effects. We also heard that a school that was much closer to the meteor's explosion was hit by a blast wave, which is again very much like a nuclear bomb. One teacher was cut up by flying pieces of glass, but thank God that she survived. Some people say that she'd saved all of her students' lives by shouting at them to get under their tables. I think she also thought that it was an American missile and her students were a lot younger than us, and they must have been terrified. Afterwards, people in the government suggested working with the Americans to invent some kind of early warning system for meteors, because it is a very alarming thing that they can strike completely without warning. So far, I think this won't happen, and people are so concerned with fighting each other on the earth that they don't often look up into the heavens to see what's coming for us there. That new movie, Don't Look Up, reminds me of this. I know that the movie's not literal, but for me, the threat of meteors is very literally real, as my home region had actually been hit and scarred by this. I hope this kind of event never happens to you or your viewers. It is something I would hope no one ever suffers from again. And please look it up on Google if you don't believe my story. You'll see it's true, and I'm not making this up. You might have even heard it on the news. I hope you enjoyed this story, and I can only tell it because nobody I know was hurt or died because of it. Maybe if I had been really hurt or my family was killed, I might not be able to tell it so easily. And I also hope that there's peace between our two countries, as you and lots of other Americans seem incredibly nice, and war is a terrible thing. During the 20th century, few nations on Earth suffered more than the Ukraine. Not only did they endure the terror of Nazi occupation during the 1940s, but they were also forced to live under the yoke of the Soviet Union for almost 100 years. The former group are famous for their vicious atrocities, and while the Holocaust is without a doubt one of the greatest crimes in world history, the latter group are responsible for perhaps one of the least talked about horrors of the 20th century. The Holodomor. Roughly translating to the Great Starvation, the Holodomor was a man-made famine caused by Soviet policies that took place between 1932 and 1933, with the death toll believed to be around 3.5 million. It left the Ukraine a desolate wasteland of unburied bodies and desperate survivors, and the country was only barely back on its feet by the time Hitler unleashed the savagery of the Waffen-SS on it. Some might call it hell, but for children like Andrei Chikatilo, they called it their childhood. Andrei was born on October 16th of 1936 in Ukraine's Sumy region and was the son of two collectivized farm workers who lived in a small one-room hut. In line with Stalinist Soviet policy, Andrei's parents weren't actually paid for their labor and instead worked for the right to cultivate a small plot of land behind their home. This obviously meant that Chikatilo's family were often short of food, and it said that Andrei and his family were sometimes forced to eat grass and leaves in order to avoid starvation. Before Andrei was born, his parents had given birth to another child, Stepan, but at the age of 4, the young boy had been kidnapped by ravenous neighbors who apparently killed, cooked, and ate the child due to their lack of food. Andre claims he was almost constantly reminded of this by his mother, Anna, and that it had a profoundly dark effect on his nascent attitudes. When the Nazi invasion of the USSR commenced in June of 1941, Andre's father was forced to fight in the Soviet Red Army and would later become a prisoner of war after being wounded in combat. This meant that for the entirety of the Second World War, Andre and his mother would have to endure the horrors on their own. They witnessed devastating aerial bombings, an incident in which German soldiers fired machine guns into a village full of nothing but civilians, and at one point, they cowered in a nearby ditch while watching Nazi soldiers set fire to their home. The stress of such experiences caused Andre to commonly wet the bed while sleeping, but instead of showing her traumatized son compassion, Anna would violently beat him every time he did so. It's also believed that Andre was present when German soldiers forced themselves on his mother, a common event during the invasion of Ukraine. Then, around 9 months after this horrific incident, Anna gave birth to a girl, who she named Tatiana. Tatiana's arrival meant Andre's mother had even less time and food for him, and by the time he started school in September of 1944, he was so weak from hunger that he regularly fainted during classes. His small stature and meek demeanor also meant that he was the victim of vicious school bullies, so no matter where he was, Andre's life was characterized by incessant, violent abuse. In order to escape such hardship, Andre escaped into books and became an excellent student as a result. He later said the only people who ever gave him any praise were his school teachers, which made a deep impression on him, and by his teenage years, he was by far the best student on the collective farm he resided on. Yet, the starvation Andre had suffered in his early years proved to be devastating to his physical development, and after emerging from a difficult puberty, Andre discovered he was mostly impotent. This caused him to feel deep self-hatred, and he was extremely awkward around female peers. However, in the mid-1950s, when Andre was 17 years old, he discovered something else about himself, that physically overpowering a girl and seeing her struggle caused him to become extremely aroused. This is most likely due to witnessing the assault of his own mother by German soldiers, something which definitely had a disturbingly Freudian effect on his developing psychology. Still, Andre made an effort to form regular romantic relationships, but after fostering a relationship with a young divorcee in his early 20s, he found he was completely unable to perform in the bedroom. The shame of this failure drove him to attempt to take his own life, but he was discovered and rescued by some of his neighbors. This only compounded the shame he felt, and in 1961, he fled the village of his birth to seek a new life in the Russian city of Rostov. Andre's family followed him to Rostov shortly afterward, and his younger sister helped set him up with a woman named Feodosia, whom he married in 1963. Andre once again committed himself to forming a healthy romantic relationship, and actually had 2 children with Feodosia. By the early 70s, Andre was working as a teacher in a city not far from Rostov. Yet despite his apparently stable married life, his desire to overpower and assault young women remained ever present. It seems it was only a matter of time before Andre acted on these evil urges, and in May of 1973, he would commit his first series of crimes. During a swimming session with some of his pupils, Andre swam over to a 15-year-old girl and grabbed her. He then became feverishly excited when she struggled against him and tried to swim away. Just a few months later, Andre locked another of his pupils in a classroom before attempting another assault. Yet when he failed to achieve rigidity, he resorted to subjecting her to a violent physical assault. This became a hallmark of Andre's psychology and is a common trait among many psychopathic killers who conflate certain urges with physical violence with terrifying frequency. Andre was also thought to have taken advantage of his role as a warden of the girls' dormitories, and on several occasions, he intruded on them in the hopes of catching them in a state of undress. Then, after moving to the coal mining town of Shakti in September of 1978, Andre's perverted behavior escalated to the point that he finally committed his first murder. On the evening of December 22nd, Andrei lured a 9-year-old girl named Yelena Zakotnova to an abandoned house he'd secretly purchased for the sole purpose of slaughtering young girls. Once again, after failing to become aroused, he began venting his frustrations on his hapless victim, choking her before stabbing her repeatedly in the chest and stomach. When she was dead, he picked up her corpse, carried her to a nearby river, and tossed her in the water. Despite a mountain of evidence indicating that Andrei was the killer, the 25-year-old laborer named Alexander Kravchenko was charged with Yelena's murder. Kravchenko had a history of similar crimes, but the local police were extremely reluctant to indict a member of the Communist Party, which Andrei had joined several years previously. Kravchenko actually had a solid alibi for the night of the murder, with his wife testifying that the pair of them had been at home all evening. However, the police then threatened to charge her with being an accomplice and essentially forced Alexander to confess to a crime he'd not committed in order to avoid having his wife put on trial. He was later convicted of the Yelena Zakotnova's murder and was executed by firing squad in July of 1983. There's little doubt that this result emboldened Andrei to the point that he believed he was invulnerable from prosecution. In his eyes, Russian law enforcement was so corrupt that they'd rather discount evidence than accuse a member of the Communist Party as being a criminal. Communists were selfless, upstanding members of this new society, people incapable of immoral or predatory actions, as they put it. But this couldn't be further from the truth, as by this point, Andrei was more monster than he was man. 3 years after he murdered Yelena, Andrei spotted a 17-year-old schoolgirl standing at a bus stop in Rostov city center. He approached her, discovered her name was Larisa Tachenko, then invited her to drink some vodka with him in some nearby woodland. Exactly why Larisa followed an older man to such a secluded place is unclear. Perhaps he played on the natural teenage spirit of rebellion, or perhaps she found herself attracted to such a confident older man. Either way, it would prove to be a final, fatal mistake. Once they were suitably alone, Andrei threw the girl to the ground, tore off her clothes, and attempted to assault her. Predictably, he once again found himself unable to perform and flew into a rage as a result. In order to prevent Larisa from screaming for help, he stuffed her mouth full of mud before beating her about the head with his fists. Then, once she was unconscious, he strangled her until she was no longer breathing, then began mutilating her corpse with his teeth, tearing out chunks of flesh before he finally came to his senses and buried her in a shallow grave. 9 months later, while walking home from grocery shopping, Andrei happened across a 13-year-old girl named Lubov Baryuk. Andrei initiated polite conversation, and the two walked and talked for around a quarter of a mile, chatting until they found themselves in a particularly secluded area. That's when Andrei suddenly turned feral, dragging Lubov off the road before stabbing her to death. Lubov's murder was one of Andrei's most disturbing, as he later confessed to stabbing the girl in a manner that constituted a sick parody of romantic intercourse. Her body was found with 22 knife wounds in the pelvic region, and her eyeballs were said to have been repeatedly and carefully sliced with the murder weapon. What followed Lubov's murder was nothing short of a frenzy of child murder, and between July and September of 1982, Andrei took the lives of 5 more young people between the ages of 9 and 18. He developed something of a behavioral standard, focusing on runaways and homeless children at either railway or bus stations. That way, he could almost guarantee that they were desperate enough to follow him, especially if he offered them relief in the form of money or alcohol. Yet the morbid detail that confirmed to the authorities that they were dealing with a serial killer were the cuts to the victim's eyeballs. Forensic analyst Viktor Burakov later stated that it was such a rare and bizarre detail that the prospect of there being multiple perpetrators was almost impossible. Despite his savage inclinations, Andrei refrained from killing again until June of 1983, when he took the life of 15-year-old Armenian girl named Laura Sarkeesian. Laura's murder prompted yet another killing spree, and by late September, Andre had murdered another 5 victims. The sheer quantity and savagery of the murders caused heavy speculation among the citizens of southern Russia. Some suggested that the murders were the work of a group harvesting organs to sell on the black market, while some purported that they were the work of a satanic cult. Several young men who'd been previously convicted of certain assaults and attempted murder were questioned by police. By the beginning of 1983, a handful of them had actually confessed to the crimes. Yet their confessions were quickly discarded by investigators who noted that they'd only been attained through the use of brutal interrogation techniques such as stress positions or sleep deprivation. The interrogations were so unbearable that 3 of those subjected to them were said to have taken their own lives following their release. Andre continued to kill unimpeded until September of 1984, when he approached 2 young women at the Rostov bus station. Little did he know, but a number of undercover detectives had been assigned to patrol routes that focused on his unusual haunts. They spotted Andre displaying the behavior pattern of the killer they'd been tracking for the better part of 5 years, and decided to follow him for a while. Not only that, but Andre's physical appearance matched the description of the man seen walking alongside one of the murder victims prior to their untimely death. As Andre reached the city's central market, and the detectives feared they might lose him in the crowds, they rushed to detain and search him. On his person, they discovered an 8-inch blade and several lengths of rope, and due to the obviously suspicious nature of these items, Andre was promptly arrested. Yet unbelievably, due to a mismatch with Andre's blood type and fluid samples recovered from crime scenes, he was determined not to be the killer. However, this mismatch didn't mean that Andre was released scot-free. It was discovered that he was guilty of theft from a previous employer, yet despite being sentenced to a year in prison for the crime, he was released after just 3 months to continue his murderous campaign. After keeping a low profile following his brush with the Soviet justice system, Andre resumed killing in August of 1985. Just over a month later, he killed again, and Soviet law enforcement were met with renewed public demands to catch the man who'd been continually preying on them. By November of 1985, the investigation had expanded to include a team of 29 dedicated detectives. Plainclothes female officers were even ordered to loiter around bus and train stations in the hopes that the killer would make a move on them. Also, in a move that was unprecedented for the Soviet Union, law enforcement took the step of asking a psychiatrist to produce a psychological profile of the killer. The psychological profile produced by Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky makes for an incredible read. If its complete authenticity is to be believed, then Dr. Bukhanovsky predicted almost everything about Andre's life, down to his impotency and what kind of job he would have worked based on the days of the week the killings took place. There was only one major mistake, and that came in the form of the USSR's increasing journalistic freedom. In the past, whenever Andre had killed, there had been a huge incentive to cover up the murders, both from a political and a law and order perspective. But as the USSR came closer and closer to collapsing, freedom of the press increased. And so did the reporting of Andre's crimes. He therefore knew how close he was to being caught, and began radically switching up the locations of his crimes in order to throw the police off his trail. He began tempering his malevolent urges, unleashing his beastly desire to kill only on business trips that took him far away from Rostov. However, Andre couldn't contain his murderous addiction for long, and he found himself unable to resist when he spotted an 11-year-old boy standing outside a theater in Shakhty, one of his old hunting grounds. He lured the boy away from the location by promising to show him a collection of Hollywood movies he had smuggled into the country, and it seems the offer of such forbidden fruit was impossible to resist. Once they were alone, Andre stabbed the boy to death, then took grim trophies from the boy's body. The discovery of the boy's corpse prompted a huge outpouring of rage from the local populace, who had been assured that the killer had been apprehended years earlier. What followed was a huge setup in police operations involving more undercover detectives, cameras hidden in train stations, and the random stopping and searching of lone men in secluded areas. This is how Andre ended up being the target of extensive police surveillance, and in several instances, he was observed approaching young lone women or children and engaging them in conversation. Then, on November 20th, after 6 days of surveillance, Andre was arrested by 4 plainclothes police officers after having exhibited the same predatory behavior in a cafe. After Andre's questioning, homicide detectives took a very unusual approach. They contacted the author of Andre's psych profile, Dr. Bukanovsky, and invited him to read extracts from it directly to Andre. Dr. Bukanovsky focused on areas which touched on Andre's traumatic childhood, and within just 2 hours of the interview commencing, Andre was a blubbering mess, confessing to each and every one of his crimes. Andre went into great detail with his interrogators, telling them that he would regularly sit or squat beside his victim until their hearts had stopped beating, adding that the victim's cries, the blood, and the agony gave me relaxation and a certain pleasure. The police then asked Andre why he would slice the eyeballs of his victims, and he replied that he had initially believed in an old Russian superstition that the image of a murderer is left imprinted upon the eyes of the victim. Andre also confessed to tasting the blood of his victims, saying it gives him chills and that he had eaten the tongues of some of his victims. All in all, Andre confessed to killing 56 people between December of 1978 and November of 1990. Yet his behavior at his trial was anything but cooperative. Not only did Andre repeatedly expose himself during the proceedings, but he also engaged in discordant, unhinged rants that sometimes included singing old socialist anthems. Upon passing the final sentence, the presiding judge made the following remark: "Taking into consideration the horrible misdeeds of which this man is guilty, this court has no alternative but to impose the only sentence that he deserves. I therefore sentence him to death." On February 14th of 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was taken from his death row cell to a soundproofed room in Novocherkassk prison and executed with a single gunshot behind the right ear. His death was quick and painless, something which he had denied his victims during their final moments. Andrei was, without a doubt, one of the most brutally evil and prolific serial killers of the 20th century, and is remembered in Russia in the same way the Green River Killer is remembered in the United States. Yet there seems to be an added brutality and madness to Chikatilo. On March 4th of 2018, at around 4:15 p.m., a woman and her young daughter were walking through a small park in the English city of Salisbury. As they walked, the woman noticed something peculiar about a man and a woman sitting on a nearby bench. The pair were sitting perfectly still, but there was something about their faces which horrified the woman and her daughter. Both appeared to be twitching, and although their eyes were wide open, their eyeballs had rolled so far back in the back of their heads that they were almost completely white. Not only that, but there was a thick white foam forming around the corners of their mouths. The horrified nursing officer immediately recognized that something was horribly wrong, and she rushed to call emergency services. Not long after, the affected couple were rushed to the hospital, but when it came to identifying the strange shared condition, doctors and nurses were at a complete loss. The only thing that was clear were the identities of the two victims. The older man was 66-year-old Sergei Skripal, and the other victim was his 33-year-old daughter, Yulia. Both were Russian citizens, but had been living in Salisbury for several years by the time they suffered their terrifying medical emergency. Neither had a medical history of seizures, blackouts, or muscle failure. Not long after, hospital staff contacted the local police force, asking them to conduct a thorough search of the Skripal's Salisbury home in the hopes that it would provide a clue as to why they had taken ill so suddenly. One of the police officers that was asked to search the Skripal's home was Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey. Nick and his partner arrived at the 2-story red brick home less than an hour after the first call to emergency services. Both donned forensic suits and slippers so not to contaminate the crime scene, but after gaining entry to the house,
There didn't appear to be anything amiss. It was only when one of the officers found 2 dead guinea pigs that they realized something was horribly wrong, as the lifeless animals were displaying alarmingly similar symptoms to their owners. The whites of their eyes were showing, and there was a thick foam clinging to the fur around their tiny mouths. Nick was then hit with the harrowing realization that it was not he that was in danger of contaminating a potential crime scene, but it was the crime scene that was in danger of contaminating him. Nick quickly informed his superiors that they might well be dealing with a complex case of poisoning, all while under the knowledge that he and his partner might be the next to suffer the same horrifying symptoms as the Skripals. Over the next few hours, Nick felt a deep exhaustion begin to set in, and also complained of excessive sweating. The following morning, he visited a local hospital for a quick checkup, but was told that all his vital signs were perfectly normal. Bailey was reassured but still felt abnormally tired, so he headed back home to take a short nap in the hopes of recovering some energy. It was during this nap that Nick began to suffer from intense and horrifying nightmares. Yet when he awoke, he continued to be plagued by hallucinations. He later described his skin feeling like it was awash with a tsunami of fire, and returned to the hospital the following day after he began to excessively and violently vomit. Doctors took a series of blood samples from him, and after a brief analysis, Nick and his wife Sarah were horrified to be informed that he would not only be forced to remain in the hospital for the foreseeable future, but he would be strictly quarantined from his fellow patients. But when Nick and Sarah demanded to know what the doctors had found in his blood, they were told that the medical team didn't want to speculate, and only when they were 100% sure of their conclusion would the couple be informed. But in reality, doctors knew exactly what kind of condition Nick was suffering from, and they only kept him in the dark due to the highest level of government intervention. Before Nick's doctors shed some light on his ailment, they had to wait until the British government was ready to make a full and frank statement to the public. You see, Nick Bailey and the Skripals were suffering from no ordinary illness, but rather the effects of one of the most powerful biological weapons known to man. The technical name of the weapon was A-234, but in the weeks to come, it would be better known by another name, Novichok. Developed in the Soviet Union in the 80s and 90s, the series of nerve agents that fell under the Novichok umbrella were designed to be the cutting edge of chemical warfare technology. Not only were they chemically engineered to circumvent contemporary laws preventing the manufacture of such weapons, they were designed to defeat standard chemical protective gear, as well as being completely undetectable. They were also designed so that even the lowest-ranking Soviet soldier would be able to deploy them at a moment's notice, with one Novichok compound requiring nothing but the addition of alcohol to transform it from a harmless pesticide into a weapon capable of killing thousands. We can only imagine the pure horror of British officials once they realized that such a substance had been used to target Sergei and Yulia Skripal. They had no idea who possessed such a chemical, how much was in their possession, or if they planned on targeting anyone else. In order to prevent what could possibly be a gargantuan loss of life, the British government needed to act fast, and they needed to act decisively. It wasn't until a full week after the attack that the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, officially announced that a deadly nerve agent was the cause of the incident. But until that moment, the majority of police and medical staff were kept in the dark. Yet for the people of Salisbury, the dread only increased with each passing day, as unfolding events suggested something was very, very wrong. Imagine it being your own hometown for a second. One moment, 2 people have been announced to be seriously ill, possibly from nothing more than overindulging on alcohol or overdosing on drugs. Then the next thing you know, hundreds of military personnel with highly advanced armored vehicles are seen patrolling through the city streets. They begin quarantining people, sealing off entire areas to the public, and even using remote machinery to tow away whole vehicles from certain houses, which are then sealed up in plastic sheeting. It must have been absolutely terrifying to have been a citizen of Salisbury back then, kept completely in the dark, being given abstract commands such as wipe down or wash your clothes and possessions if you've been outside in the past few days. They must have thought the problem was of apocalyptic scale. By the time the Prime Minister finally announced the cause of the crisis, it was clear that the nerve agent in question could only have been manufactured in Russia. Theresa May announced that there were only two plausible explanations. Either this was a direct act by the Russian state against our country, or the Russian government lost control of this potentially catastrophically damaging nerve agent and allowed it to get into the hands of others. Both possibilities were abjectly terrifying, but the latter was without a doubt the most dreadful of the two prospects. If it was a targeted assassination undertaken by Russian agents, at least they were under some kind of centralized command and would no doubt be under orders to keep casualties to a minimum. But if a substance such as Novichok had fallen into hands of fanatical terrorists, there was no telling how many more people might be killed. There was simply no way of knowing if those responsible for the attack were planning to strike on a much larger scale, and the incident with the Skripals were merely some kind of test run. If an agent as powerful as Novichok found its way into a British reservoir or river system, tens of thousands of people could be killed in just a matter of weeks. In the days that followed Sergei, Yulia, and Nick's hospitalizations, the Russian government flatly denied all knowledge of the attack, and as a result, the investigation became a race to identify those responsible. A team of police officers, military intelligence analysts, and members of the British Secret Service began poring over hundreds of hours of security camera footage from all over the city of Salisbury. It took them months to comb through more than 5,000 hours of video files, but there came a point where investigators identified two men whose actions and movements were extremely suspicious. The day before the attack, the two men had arrived at London's Gatwick Airport on a flight from Moscow before immediately taking a train to Salisbury. British intelligence agents who reviewed the footage of them immediately recognized their movements as that of a reconnaissance mission and began to track their movements more thoroughly. They were found to have spent 2 nights at the City Stay Hotel in Bow, East London, and police then moved to isolate and analyze the room they stayed in. Sure enough, traces of a Novichok chemical weapon were found in the hotel room. Police then demanded that the hotel staff turn over all information on their 2 short-stay guests. They were given the names Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Bolsherov, names which at first meant nothing to any of Britain's intelligence agencies. But nevertheless, the British government demanded these 2 men return to the UK to explain their strange behavior and movement patterns. Shockingly, the Russian government announced that it had been in touch with the 2 men who claimed to be innocent of all charges. They insisted that they were merely tourists with an interest in cathedrals and that, due to Salisbury's magnificent cathedral, it had been on their bucket list of holiday destinations for quite some time. However, despite asserting their innocence, they refused to return to Britain, announcing they were afraid of being scapegoated and that the accusations were down to nothing but Russophobia. Despite identifying 2 potential suspects, Salisbury police were still unable to work out why the 2 men might specifically target Sergei Skripal, and there came a point where officers asked their military intelligence counterparts if there was anything they needed to know. That's when it came out that Sergei was not your average Russian expat and had once been in the employ of Russia's top-secret Main Intelligence Directorate, or GRU. In short, Sergei was an ex-Russian spy, and no ordinary Russian spy either. He had been a double agent, working for the British. After 9 years of selling secrets to British intelligence, Sergei Skripal was arrested in December of 2004. At his trial, after being paraded before the court in a cage, Skripal was convicted of high treason and was only spared the death sentence because he cooperated fully with Russian prosecutors. He was disgraced, stripped of his military decorations, and sentenced to 13 years in a high-security detention facility. Yet after serving just 4 years of his sentence, Skripal and 3 other NATO-aligned spies were freed as part of a spy swap. The 4 men were exchanged for 10 Russian agents arrested in the United States, and in 2011, Sergei, his wife, and his 2 children emigrated to the UK to escape the country he had once betrayed. Sergei seemed to live a relatively quiet life in the UK, and there appeared to be no lasting animosity between himself and the Russian government. Sergei's daughter was even allowed to return to Moscow in 2014 in order to work a sales position at a large Russian corporation, something which never would have been permitted during the Cold War. But then, in 2017, Sergei's 43-year-old son Alexander returned to Russia on a visit to St. Petersburg, but it was a visit he would never return from. Sergei attempted to contact his son, but found his calls went straight to voicemail. He began to fear the worst, and soon his fears were confirmed. Sergei was contacted by the British Home Office, who told him that Alexander was dead. Yet when he inquired as to the circumstances of his son's death, the Home Office didn't have any answers for him. Alexander had died in extremely mysterious circumstances, so mysterious that it wasn't clear if he was murdered or not. The British government concluded that even if there was foul play surrounding Alexander's death, there was no obvious motive and no obvious suspects. But to Sergei, the explanation was painfully clear. His ex-comrades in the GRU were responsible, and they had murdered Alexander as revenge for his father's treachery. As far as Sergei was concerned, his son's murder meant all bets were off, and he once again began playing a role in the Western intelligence community. Once British law enforcement understood Sergei's backstory, as well as his desire to avenge his son's death, it became clear why he had been targeted for assassination. And once the authorities knew which organization might be responsible, they were potentially able to link their two supposedly innocent cathedral enthusiasts to the Russian secret services. This is how they discovered that Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Boshirov were merely the aliases of two Russian espionage agents, whose real names were Alexander Mishkin and Anatoly Chepika, respectively. The passport numbers of their aliases were only 3 digits different from dozens of other documents which depicted their likeness, with each passport being a different Russian-style name. Despite their willingness to deny responsibility for the chemical attack, the Russian state was completely unable to deny the existence of the two agents who carried it out. After a series of bomb attacks in the Czech Republic, Mishkin had been declared a wanted criminal by the Czech police in 2014. Once again, the Russians denied any involvement in the attacks and insisted that it was pure coincidence that Mishkin had been awarded Russia's highest military medal shortly after the bombings. But intelligence agencies all over Europe knew this was a weak attempt at concealing Russian involvement. Anatoly Chepika was also involved in these bomb attacks and was also awarded the Hero of Russia medal following his involvement. The attacks targeted 2 ammunition factories thought to have been producing ammunition which was destined to be sold to Ukraine for their defense of the Donbass. In light of the recent ground invasion of Ukraine, this is particularly disturbing, as it suggests that the Russians are not only willing to strike out at their more peaceful neighbors, but that in terms of conquests, they've been playing the long game for the better part of 8 years. By the fall of 2008, it was painfully obvious that Vladimir Putin himself had authorized the use of an extremely dangerous chemical weapon on the streets of Britain. And it was only by a stroke of pure luck that only one person had lost their life. By some miracle, both members of the Skripal family survived the attack, as did Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey. But a woman by the name of Dawn Sturgis hadn't been so lucky. Towards the end of June, Dawn and her partner were admitted to the hospital and were noted to be displaying similar symptoms to the Skripals. A few days later, Dawn was dead, but her partner, a man named Charlie Rowley, survived the ordeal. He then gave an interview in which he stated that he and Dawn had found a sealed box of perfume in a nearby park. The perfume appeared to be completely unused, so much so that the plastic dispenser nozzle hadn't even been attached yet. Dawn had sprayed some of the bottle's contents on her wrist, then noted it hadn't smelled like anything, which a small quantity of the substance had apparently spilled onto Charlie's hands in the process of attaching the dispenser nozzle. Within 15 minutes of the substance touching her wrist, Dawn Sturgis was finding it difficult to breathe, and Charlie managed to call an ambulance before the pair passed out. Their apartment was then so contaminated by the substance later determined to be Novichok that the entire apartment building was destroyed. The box of perfume was found in a place called Amesbury, a town just 7 miles north of Salisbury, meaning that Mishkin and Chepika had obviously used the town as a dumping ground for their supply of Novichok before they made the journey back to London. It was later discovered that they'd been instructed to spray the chemical on the Skripal's front door handle, the only place that they would both be certain to touch. Sadly, Dawn passed away a few weeks after being exposed to Novichok, and her partner Charlie was left to mourn her loss. He'll forever remain in the shadow of the knowledge that he lost the love of his life due to reckless evil committed by the Russian secret services. I'd like to tell you that there is some kind of ending to the story, that justice was meted out and that those responsible faced consequences for their actions. But I can't do that, because as we've seen with the invasion of Ukraine, the story of Vladimir Putin's dictatorship and the evil it has committed has yet to reach any kind of conclusion. It's a tale that continues to unfold as I record and post this narration, and there's no telling when or if those that unleashed a chemical weapon on the United Kingdom will ever face the punishments they deserve.
Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories and big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.